This is Basic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
I think what happened was that all the parts were mounted on the top of the board in the computer, but the board was mounted inside the console upside down with all the parts facing down. The user of the educational system was being punished for having the wrong answer as opposed to just being told, no, try again.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Scott Scheiman worked at Atari for about 7 years, where he was part of the Atari 400-800 design team. He worked on the computer's SIO interface, the Atari 850 interface, and the Telelink I communications cartridge. He also wrote the Educational System Master Cartridge software for use with the Talk and Teach cassette tapes. This interview took place on July 12, 2016.
Well, interest in computers goes back to the beginning practically. I think it was junior high school that I suspect it was through a teacher, but I got some sort of a connection. For one thing, I was reading books. I believe IBM had a computer called the 850, which had a book in the library. I don't remember for sure whether I've got the number of that computer right or not, but I believe it was didn't have main memory. It had a drum. And programmers were writing in assembler language in such a way that the jump instructions, the code segments were being timed such that in order to get optimal use out of the computer, you wrote the right number of instructions so that when you jumped to another place, the drum was in the right position as it was rotating for timing. It was an amazing book. But anyway, I was very interested in that. I had an interest in electronics. I mean, I built a couple of Heathkits and that sort of thing, but I was never really that good in electronics. It was when computers showed up in my life that I really found my calling. There's a story of me in high school where the math teacher, I wish I could remember his name, but he decided to have a little lecture about the BASIC language, and he did that for people who came to school early. I think there were maybe 5 of us. And I just took notes and tried to get a sense of what this was. But I was so excited by it that I spent my lunchtime writing my very first computer program. Actually, I have to back up a little bit. No, let me do it in that order. My first computer program was written at lunch that day, and I went to him at the end of the day and said, "Can we run this?" In the math classroom was an old teletype, and it was used to dial up to a time-sharing system that I believe was a GE computer. I was living in Denver, by the way, and the computer, I believe, was in Phoenix, so it was a long-distance call, and computer time was expensive in those days, too. But time-sharing existed. But he wanted to save the connect time, so the very first thing I did was type up a computer tape of my program. And I still have the printout from that. The first line was a basic print statement. I said, print prime numbers from 1 to 10,000. And I had to type that line 3 times over because every time what I typed was prime numbers from 1 to L,000. That was because in those days the typewriter didn't have a 1 key, and I was, a student in the typing class as well. But there were no other mistakes, and even then I had the idea that if you, I think I'd gotten that into class that morning, that if you retyped the line number, it would replace the line with the subsequent line. So anyway, he stayed after class with me. After school, we dialed into the service. I fed this paper tape into the machine and typed run, and this was maybe the last time it happened in my life, but this was a program that ran perfectly the very first time. Now, I know a lot of programmers are going to say, huh? But no, I was really proud of that until I got home, and my parents were saying, where were you? But very, very understanding parents. I learned Fortran shortly after that and got involved with a computer club that was sponsored by IBM, and just went on from there. I majored in computers when I went to college. Computer science as a curriculum existed in those days, but it was still a time that a lot of schools didn't have an actual degree in that. So I think computer science degrees showed up maybe within 5 years of the time I went to college. I probably ought to put some dates on this. I graduated from high school in 71, graduated with a BS in 75, and then got an MS 2 years later in 77. So 77 was the year I started at Atari.
How did you get hired there?
Well, basically, the first thing was that when I went off to graduate school, I chose the location based upon the reputation of the area, which is to say Silicon Valley. So I went to Stanford, and they had essentially job fairs, sort of like cattle calls, and the companies would come in, send their recruiters, and people would, go from booth to booth and talk briefly to the recruiters. I got 2 job offers out of that one interview, and then a follow-up interview with a third company. And the 2 job offers were Boeing, and they were just looking for bodies, I guess. Either that or I was very impressive in that interview. I would have been working on the B-2 bomber if I went to them, and within a year after, obviously I didn't go to them, but within a year Carter canceled that project. I think some president restarted it later. If I went to Sylvania, they also gave me an offer out of the box. I would have stayed there in Silicon Valley and been working on cruise missiles. Now, of course, they became real, and so I could have had a job for a long time. The third company was Atari, and they were the ones who were interested in a follow-up interview. And, the follow-up interviews went very well, and they gave me an offer, and I was much more interested in doing something that wasn't war-related. Not that I was a gamer or anything like that. I mean, it was really an engineering job they were offering me. But, I chose them out of the 3.
Nice. And what were you hired to do? What was your first job there?
Well, the very first job was a backup project for the what they call it, the 26 was original, with the VCS, Video Computer System. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things I was looking up dates before our interview today and trying to figure out the timeline. Like I said, I think I started right out of college, so my guess is my start month was July. And the VCS, the actual product, was announced in September of that very same year. So this little backup project that I was on was even a smaller number of months than I remember. But it was sort of like if, I believe the main thing about the VCS was the custom chip. I think its name was Stella?
Stella was the name of the VCS itself. The graphics chip was the TIA.
Must have been the TIA then. But anyway, the first silicon came in and worked. I think they had one little tweak. So they were lucky. First silicon isn't really necessarily all that promising. But they were able to announce that in time for Christmas that year, which meant that my little side project, which was the backup project, was folded pretty much immediately.
So to clarify, this backup project was in case the VCS didn't work out, would be an alternate product?
Yeah. Now, of course, Atari didn't want to go that route. It would mean OEMing half of the stuff rather than being based on their own product. So that's a cost-sharing issue. There were also actual issues with the silicon. Now, for that product or product to be or backup project, the silicon did exist. I believe the primary processor and the graphics processor were both products of Signetics, if my memory is correct. The processor itself was the 2650 chip. The backup processor is something that I don't know whether they had promised it just to Atari or whether they would have wanted to sell it to anybody who wanted it. But the first silicon on that particular thing didn't run on 5 volts. So the breadboard, the one and only breadboard that we put together for that thing, had to have a 6.5 volt extra power supply, which of course is another thing that all the engineers were, chewing their, grinding their teeth over. But anyway, I did the schematic for the motherboard for that thing, And of course, a real motherboard was never made. It was just a wire-wrapped breadboard. And then two engineers spent the rest of the summer doing demo cartridges for it. So I was one of the programmers on that little thing. And the other fellow that I asked you to get a name for before this interview was, I'm thinking, was Howard Bornstein. So the two of us, and that's, don't trust my memory too strongly on that one. It's just my best guess here. So anyway, I wrote a Pong-like cartridge for the thing, and he was doing something that I think was tank-based. The peripherals, the controllers that we were using were exactly the same ones that were being designed for the VCS. But the VCS was successful because the silicon came in good, and they announced it in September, and that was that. So pretty much right after that, I was transferred into the very early middle, I guess, phases of the computer system.
Before we move on, do you remember if this thing had a name, a code name, or something?
Yeah, I probably did, and I don't remember. Okay. Apologies for that.
Did you say you still have this thing in your?
I have the breadboard. Physically, I walked off with it. I think I did it without permission. Uh-huh. It's been in storage all these years. Heaven knows if it would fire up. The silicon's probably okay. If it has electrolytic capacitors on it, I'd want to change them before I powered it up. And the real issue probably is the EEPROM. I have no idea how long an EEPROM holds its memory. My guess is I only have one EEPROM for it, which is probably my Pong game. So the tank game may be history now. But
in my very limited experience with dealing with Atari 8-bit cartridges on EEPROM, as long as they were kept in the dark, they're fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this has a chance. Of course, it was in the garage for a long time and also has been exposed to heat.
Okay, so that project got canceled, and then they put you in the 8-bit realm?
Yes, indeed.
So what was next?
Well, the silicon was in development at that time, and my memory of it is that for a lot of the early design on the chips, they were relying on their Skunk Works group up in Grass Valley.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking chips now. We're talking 400, 800, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So there are 3 custom chips in that. Let's see if I remember the code names. There was Antic, CTIA, and Pokey.
Right.
In certain ways, I think the development of that was really spin-offs of the ideas that went into the chip in the VCS. But and a lot of that was pretty far along. But I think they primarily tapped me, not so much as a developer, but like an extra set of eyes, I'm thinking. I really was green right out of college. To just look at the design and say, well, there's a problem here, to the extent that I was able to see something. So I'm not really sure how much you could say I was a designer at that point. But there was one very special thing that I think happened in that time frame, and that was a group of 4 of us hopped into a light plane and flew up to Grass Valley one day. And I'm trying to remember who the 4 were. I know I'm going to remember 3 names with a fair degree of certainty. Of course, one of them is me. I think Joe DeCure was one of the 4 of us, and I'm pretty sure, like 98% sure that Jay Miner was one of us. But the fellow who was the pilot, I don't know who that is. I suspect he was a chip designer, because I think the basis of the trip was to go talk about some details about those 3 chips. And it really was just a day trip. The pilot was only visual rated, so we weren't flying at night or anything like that, and I know we didn't stay overnight. But my memory of that place up there, the shop, I think the name of the company was Cyan Engineering. Mm-hmm. Little tiny shop. My memory of it is sort of like a 3-car garage that filling stations have to work on cars. It was about that size. Maybe it was 2 rooms, a little bigger than that. I don't know how many employees they had. a wild guess would be 4, but I'm thinking it's probably really more like 10 people worked up there. I have no idea what kind of connections they had with Sunnyvale. I mean, really, if you think about it, a phone call would have been just as good as hopping in a plane. But this is the sort of thing where people could do it if they can.
Right, sure.
And for me, I think it was a junket. Introduce me to people, give me a flavor of the wider sense of what the company's about, and all that sort of stuff. The one thing I do remember and also I suspect that was maybe my introduction to the Pokey chip, which was, I think I got to consult a little bit on that chip, but not much. The basic idea, I think I was being introduced to the serial bus, and part of it, I think, was just to get a sense of whether talking serially was going to work. I believe the peripherals in that time frame, or at least the first ones that were introduced, were the cassette machine, a printer that was only 40 characters wide, and the disk drive, which was, of course, the most important first peripheral. But I think all that stuff was just gleams in people's eyes at that point. So I don't know what input I really had to the Pokey chip per se. It was maybe more like a learning experience for me. But the other thing that I found a lot of fun was just to look around at this shop, and there were a bunch of big animatronic puppets all over the walls. And the story, as I best remember it, is that aside from being a skunk works that was working on advanced chip concepts for TV-based displays and games and stuff, was that they were also the basic designers of all of the automated or animated puppets in the Pizza Time Theater, which of course later became Chuck E. Cheese.
Sure.
So, in my darker moments when I want to let my mind go to more interesting interpretations of the past, and probably the mundane reality of it was that if you turn the lights down and shone the light up so that you'd get shadows on these puppets' faces, you would be looking at a set for a Stephen King movie. But really, it was just a shop, and it was a meet and greet kind of thing, and a little bit of fun in an airplane. Jay Miner's dog went along for the ride, and nice little puppy, sort of like Toto from Wizard of Oz. I kind of remember it as being sort of a salt and pepper coat, which probably meant that the dog was getting on in years. We had one moment up there where we ran into, we got surrounded by clouds, and of course this pilot wasn't instrument rated. So he did a maneuver that all of us were going, to avoid the clouds. And the dog had a little bit of difficulty with that part of the ride. But for the rest of it, he was a really nice little dog. And of course, Jay was a wonderful person. I do remember him warmly. Except since I wasn't involved with chip design, there were a bunch of people that I only interacted with very infrequently.
So the internet says that you did do some work on the SIO. Can you tell me if that's accurate and what you did?
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure that I saw a need for being able to distinguish between data and commands. And believe it or not, before this interview, I haven't had time to go back and jog my memory about what all the pins were on the serial port. By the way, I won't claim any connection with that god-awful big giant monster black connector, but anyway, I think the number of pins and a lot of the signals were already set before I got in there. I mean, the cassette drive, for example, was, the fact that it had its own dedicated interface was something else somebody else came up with. But I believe the idea of one of the pins being an on-off signal to distinguish between commands and data was my idea. And I'm pretty sure, but to be more sure, I'd have to have more time to just really go back and research the whole protocol and jog my own memory. But I'm pretty sure the whole idea of how devices were addressed and the actual handshake, like how you actually use the bus, where you're really kind of getting more into software than hardware, what baud rate to use, and a bunch of stuff like that. I think a lot of those ideas, if not maybe all of them, were mine.
Nice. Was I've heard that the speed of the SAO was artificially limited in order to keep RF emissions down to make the FCC happy. Is that true?
Don't know.
Okay.
Everything inside the case was designed that way. One of the issues, I'm just thinking out loud here, one of the issues was clock speed for the overall clocking, and the clocking was tied to the color signal on NTSC television. One of the possible reasons that the baud rate was limited, but purely speculation now, I'm not saying anything about knowing anything here, but one of the possible reasons for the limiting of the speed was the clock wasn't fast enough to be able to subdivide it. Now that's, it could also be, I forget whether there was any DMA, I suspect not. So even the rate of data into the RAM could have been a limitation. But the theory that you proposed is also plausible. I really don't know, though. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Just it's fine. Let's see. And you worked on the 850 interface.
Yeah.
Tell me all about that.
Well, you've gone out of order now. Do you want me to jump to that, or?
No, I'm sorry. Let's go in order, if that's
well. Now here's something that I yesterday I was thinking was true, and I thought about it, and I'm not so sure. I'm having a little trouble with this, but another aspect of the 800 and 400 that I think I at least had some input to was the memory map. I'm not sure, but I think I may have also been the one who did the first connection diagram between the chips. Essentially the schematic, the motherboard schematic. Now that doesn't mean, I'm in hindsight, I'm not all that happy with the memory map of the, particularly the small amount of RAM, although you couldn't get much more anyway. And everything was cost driven in those days. So if you wanted to have like a fractional segment of memory and throw more chips at it, it would have cost a lot just for a very little amount of extra RAM. So if you really think about it, taking the overall memory space of the processor, which I believe it was a 16-bit address space, so that's 65,000 addresses, and which is a power of 2, taking everything and subdividing that into chunks that are like halves and quarters and eighths, all the power of 2 kind of stuff is really the way to save money. So, but it does mean that the memory space was not well utilized. I suspect I was consulted, and I'm not sure that I actually truly drove those decisions. And the other decisions, like the memory being on daughter cards, that was definitely not me. But after those decisions were made, I think, this is where I'm not sure about my memory, but I think I was the one who drew the very first schematic for the motherboard. Now, I may be wrong about that. In any case, someone else did the layout, the board layout, so that wasn't me. But when just as an interesting story, and I think I really can't take credit for this little glitch. And, talking about glitches during development is kind of like software people saying, well, I fixed this bug on this day, and I fixed this bug on this day, and it's like nobody listening to your podcast is going to care. But this little story was kind of cute. The controllers, let's see, the VCS had, I believe, 2 ports, so you could have 2 people play against each other.
Right.
The 400, 800 had 4, so they were thinking of like having multiplayer, some degree of multiplayer. But anyway, the same controllers were used, so the same little connectors would be glued onto soldered onto the motherboard. The first motherboard came back, and all of the pins were all scrambled on all 4 of those ports. And I think, this is just from memory, I think what happened was that all the parts were mounted on the top of the board in the computer, but the board was mounted inside the console upside down with all the parts facing down in the BCS. And the pinout had just been copied from the schematic. And actually, since it was a schematic issue and not a layout issue, so it could have been my mistake. This scrambling of the pins because you flipped the board upside down wasn't accounted for. So one of the techs had to go in and cut traces on the board and solder on all these little wires that were sticking up off the board. But for the most part, the prototype worked. And of course, that was later in the cycle when everything was on silicon. There was a bunch of the development cycle where people were writing software for this thing where the chips were being simulated in giant TTL wire-wrapped big black boxes with lots of cards that had to be separated from each other so much that all those little wire-wrapped pins had space between the cards. Simulators are, I forget what they were called, but essentially chip simulators. So, I mean, it was really much later in the cycle when the first board came in and the chips were actually going on the computer and stuff. But anyway, yeah, so I don't know for sure about my memory about whether I did that schematic or not. I think I did, particularly since now, I do remember making that mistake about those connectors being backwards upside down. The other thing is that I and another developer, and I'm thinking it's Howard again. Oh, no, I've got to correct an earlier mistake. The two people I think who were writing the software, those demo chips for that backup VCS thing, the Signetics-based, I think the other programmer was not Howard Bernstein. I think it was Brad Stewart.
Okay.
Not sure. But the software design for the computer was handed to two people, and that was myself and I believe Howard Bornstein. So the two of us started trying to design the software that was going to go into the 800 and 400. Well, it turns out we blew it. I think it was two people who were both green. Hadn't worked on a project that was big enough that it wasn't something that just an individual programmer was going to work on. And I think we were both trees rather than forest kind of people. So we got mired in the details and didn't get the overview right. So after I don't know how many months, they pulled us both off of that project and handed it over to some much more senior people. So we get into that list of names that I was asking to help me with. Harry Stewart, Lane Winter, I'm not sure. I think there were three primary designers and coders. So I don't know where Howard went in the mix of that little, when they pulled us off and realized things weren't on schedule and needed to get it moving. I think Harry Stewart and Lane Winter and maybe Larry Kaplan, I'm not sure, were pulled in, and they were the primary coders for the operating system. During that period of time, I sort of fell into the background. I do know somewhere in that period of time I worked on that serial protocol that we mentioned, but I don't remember the time frame or exactly how I was involved, whether I actually coded or just designed. But there was another part of the 800 which I did do and I'm very proud of, and that's the character set.
Really? Tell me all about that. It's a beautiful character set.
I mean, I had to do something, or they gave me something, and that was the character set. It was basically ASCII. Now, I'm thinking it was the Antic chip that had all of the graphics modes for being able to display characters in different modes with senders and stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, ASCII is a 7-bit code, and you got another 128 possible characters, and we were all thinking what to do about that. And of course, marketing got involved too. I think some other computers existed at that time, and they were using those characters to do graphics. So marketing said, do the same as these other computers. That's a vague memory, I don't know, but it wasn't just me, but the idea to do all those little lines and circles and shapes that could be put together in groups of 4 to outline things and whatever was partly me and partly one or two, maybe mostly me for all I know. I mean, I'm sure the sort order was not something that anybody thought of, so that's probably, without thinking about it, something that I came up with. But anyway, the idea that we would then want to have characters that could be glued together by placing them adjacent to each other horizontally and vertically pretty much meant that it got reduced to an 8x8 bit character set with none of those other modes that were built into the Antic computer ever being used. But that's sort of the way things go sometimes. Design things, and then when you get into the actual implementation, it doesn't work. The one thing I do remember, a couple of things. One was when I was working on that stuff, I know the silicon didn't exist because I clearly have a memory of sitting at that giant breadboard box when I was doing that, and I don't think we had many of them, so we probably, all the engineers who were working on this stuff had to timeshare on that thing. But I also remember one of the executives coming through one day, and I'm guessing, crossing my fingers here, that it was Al Alcorn. Now I have to back up a little bit. 8x8 is BITCH to do a character set in anyway, but the fact that it was synced to the color frequency on an NTSC television meant that you got all of these little color artifacts. But the lowercase m and w, I suppose uppercase m and w were a bit of a problem too, but the lowercase m in particular was giving me a lot of grief. And I think it was Al Alcorn came through one day, looked at this thing, and basically panned it. You see, it's like here I am working on my baby, and oh my God, it gets shut down. So, but it was a good thing because it got me off of whatever mental stuckness I was, and an M came into existence that worked, at least somewhat worked. But anyway, now that in terms of my name being on that operating system, it's the character set is the reason that my name's on.
Nice. Was this just designed on graph paper?
No, on the machine.
Nice. So you've got all the the graphics characters, this little dot and so there was there meetings on like, okay, we need to have the spade and heart and card for card games, and we need this and that. Were there discussions about what would go in and what wouldn't fit?
Oh, I'm sure there were. I'm not sure they were as formal as meetings, but yeah, discussions at least. Absolutely.
Cool. Nice. So, okay, did the character set, and then what?
Well, let's see. I got a free trip to CES.
Nice.
I was never a salesman, and also they had techs working on setting up and tearing down the booth, so it was really just an opportunity to go and get a little bit of the wider culture of the industry. I went to 2 CES shows, and I'm pretty sure the second one would have been when the 850 came out, which I'm guessing, this is one of the things I couldn't find when I was doing my research. I couldn't find on the internet what year the 850 was introduced, but I'm suspecting it was 1 year later. So, let's see. The 850 was probably right away the next project. So better part of a year working on that. Now I know the internet says that I designed it, and we need to clarify that.
Sure.
A lot of the interactions that I had was with the fellow who was the head of the industrial design group. Basically, he led the people who did all of the motherboards, the getting things ready to go into manufacturing. Certainly all the plastic, all the controllers were under him. And I wish I could remember his name. You wouldn't know off the top of your head, would you?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, so anyway, although I was reporting to another person, I'm thinking it might have been Harry Stewart for a while, but Brian Johnston took over from whoever the person who hired me in was sometime within the first year that I was there, and I think Brian was my manager for the rest of the time there. But there was, strong interaction, at least for someone like me, between the hardware and software group, and there weren't that many software people anyway. There was the three of the people working on the operating system, me, of course, on the character set. But I was kind of like the crossover person between the hardware and software. So, for example, I did those 2 schematics. And but the guy who was in charge of the hardware group, I interacted with him a lot. And by the time the 850 came along, it was pretty clear that hardware was not going to be my strong suit. The rest of my career was software. So by that time, I was sort of consulting on the hardware design, but I got a lot of my ideas shot down. Um, Now, you may have to correct me on this. I'm really going from memory. I would have had to do more research before this interview to even remember how the serial bus worked, but I'm kind of thinking that a Pokey chip needed to be in every device in order for it to actually work on the serial port. So Pokey would have been there in the 850 to handle the communications back to the computer and then down to the daisy chain to the other peripherals. But then there were the four RS-232 ports. And of course, to handle RS-232, the standard way of doing it in those days was with a chip called a UART. But a couple things that I would have wanted to have in there, like a 25-pin rather than 9-pin RS-232, mostly because I was a purist, not so much that I really thought through whether 9 pins was worth it or not. But even UARTs were shot down. And of course, multiple Pokey chips would have been impossible, or some sort of way of multiplexing Pokey wouldn't have been it either. So I'm racking my memory. I think the reason UARTs wouldn't work is that they required voltages that would have required that the power supply in this device be off the charts in terms of cost. So anyway, all the serial ports had to be done with software, essentially polling the serial pins. Now, none of these things were things that I would have wanted in the design, so you can already get that I was a little bit more out of the loop. And you have to definitely get that, in a certain sense, I was not the 850 designer. But on the software side, there were actually two people who worked on it, and that, I think, hasn't gotten out into the lore, and I believe it's appropriate since someone else worked on it. Unfortunately, I don't remember the fellow's name. But so anyway, the software was most of that next year that I was there, and I think the two of us worked on it together. I believe even by that time, like that was like only my second year, maybe third year at Atari. Of the team of two, I was the senior person, which is scary if you think back about it. For the most part, we split the work between the software that went onto the computer. Essentially, it was a loadable driver, if you want to think of it that way. And the firmware, or the handling of the juggling of all the pins, basically, in the 850 itself. So I did more of the firmware stuff, and he did the driver that got downloaded. The protocol of establishing communications with the computer and getting that driver downloaded, I think, was somewhat my idea, and there was, of course, that not really a mistake, but let's say it's a greeny issue of the fact that once multiple drivers needed to be loaded, you needed to daisy chain the address, the address that linked to the driver. So the idea of multiple drivers required that, since the firmware in the 850 didn't download a daisy chain at the time it was developed, it was the only device in its mind. It always had to be at the end of the daisy chain, but of course developers after me figured that out, and it ultimately wasn't a big deal. But I'm always one of these people who likes to be a perfectionist even though I'm not, and so I think of it as a mistake. There was another issue, I don't know whether it happened to all the printers or whether, I think it did, or whether it was an 850 specific. Well, there are two things. One was I reserved a character in the character set. That meant that one character could never be printed on the printer. I've always mildly regretted that. Didn't put an escape sequence on that character. But there was also an issue with all the printers, I think, where a line would repeat and print twice. Ultimately, I don't think that had anything to do with me. In fact, it was such an unknown bug, nobody understood it, that I had already left Atari by the time someone gave me a phone call and they said, "Hey, we found the bug," and it was in the operating system. So, but there's all those little things that are just in the lore, and even if I didn't personally have anything to do with them, I kind of remember those little things. And I'm sure anybody who used the computer was probably, I don't know, you had to be kind of a crossover between being enjoying the machine and being irritated by it. So,
Nice.
So anyway, the two of us did the 850. I seem to recall there were two peripherals that were coming out at the same time. They did a printer I believe it was the first wide printer. It was a dot matrix printer. It was basically just straight out OEM from Centronics. I don't even remember whether they changed the color of the plastic to make that printer. It certainly didn't look like anything else on the line. But then again, and I think more for timing than anything else, the first 850 was in that metal box rather than plastic.
Right. The first ones were black metal, and those are pretty rare. I don't think they did that for too long before they came out with the plastic ones. So yeah, tell me, what do you know why they did that? Was it just?
I think it was just schedule. Now, it was they, not me, but I'm pretty sure it was just doing the plastic would have required iterations through the various manufacturers and et cetera, et cetera. They certainly didn't do it for cost. But then again, the other two peripherals, the printer, like I said, I don't even know if they changed the color of the plastic to match the, and of course the appearance, the physical boxiness of it. And then there was the acoustic modem, and they didn't even bother changing its color. It was black. So, but it was approaching the CES sometime in December, and they had they had the printer, but I'm not sure they had anything that was actually going to print anything on the printer. I mean, you could write a little basic program and do something with the basic cartridge that would print on the printer. And the 850 was sitting there running the printer. But then there was this acoustic modem, and I'm thinking to myself a month before CES, so how are you going to demo this thing? And so the idea, it was my idea, and it came up very much at the last minute. Now, of course, revisionist memory, I'm thinking that this thing happened over Christmas vacation, but it could have been any time during the December CES, which of course is in early January. I realized that there was nothing that was going to show off the modem. So I came up with the idea of just, doing what anybody would do with a modem in those days, was just attach it to a dumb terminal and talk to a time-sharing system. So I came up with the idea of doing dumb terminal software. Now, for the life of me, I can't remember what we actually had the acoustic modem talk to. Whether we actually dialed a time-sharing system or we strung a phone line across the booth and had two 800s talking to each other through the modem. Mm-hmm. But it was, as the lore online says, it was a 4-day project. It was really just totally thrown together. And the idea of it was a full duplex, send-receive, character only, with word wrap. Because, of course, terminals in those days were 80 characters wide, and the 800-400 was 40 characters. So I also programmed it to recognize the punctuation, like space and commas and stuff, and wrap the line so that words weren't chopped in the middle. So, I mean, the only reason that was 4 days is that everything still was being done in assembly language in those days. And it was hardly a finished product, but it was definitely a worthwhile last-minute project for demoing the thing at CES. And then, really, just to talk about the finishing, I've never been that good at user interfaces. So, I mean, I think the finishing on the project was, I don't remember, but I think I even threw in the ability for it to send a break character, which even then nobody was using anymore. And, of course, it needed the ability to dial. So I added a user interface for people to type in phone numbers and stuff like that. I really don't remember the user interface, but the whole thing being turned into a product, the core code was written in 4 days. The entire cartridge took 3 months. And yet the user interface wasn't all that great. It was functional. So that's that story.
Nice. So so after you did the initial program just for CES, did you continued with that in order to turn it to the finished Telelink product?
Yeah, I finished that cartridge. Yeah, so that's one of the 2 cartridges that I did.
What was the other?
The other was the software that ran the educational system, the cassette-based tapes from Dorset Educational Systems.
Oh, I didn't know that was you.
Programmer for that, and also had a lot to do with the tape mastering, or should I say remastering.
All right, so let's get into that, because I have a particular interest in the Dorset educational tapes. So I'm going to give you a little a little background. Last year, an Atari user came to me, and he had a huge collection of Dorset tapes. The Dorset came out with a whole bunch of them that Atari didn't come out with, and he had basically the whole collection. So I digitized all of them, and another Atari user named Thomas Cherryholmes cleaned up the tapes and made it so that they could all run in emulators, that sort of thing. He also wrote new software to publish Dorset compatible tape. So you could come up with new educational software today using modern computers.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So yeah, I spent like months with my head in the Dorset thing, and so I'd like to know everything you can remember about how the tapes were mastered and what went into the software. And I mean, it's strange little software with such a limited interface of just typing, I think, 1, 2, or 3. So how did that work, and how did it work? Did you meet Lloyd Dorset? And tell me everything.
I don't remember meeting him, but my guess is I did. That little piece of software is not exactly my pride and joy because, well, for one thing, I've never had a particularly strong personal opinion of the audio capabilities of Pokey. But, the thing made a sort of a blatty, buzzy noise when you gave the wrong answer. Kind of like the user of the educational system was being punished for having the wrong answer as opposed to just being told, no, try again.
Right.
And Mr. Dorset didn't like that sound at all, and I have to confess that my opinion is that he was right about that. And so I just wasn't that good a sound programmer. I came up with something on the Pokey chip, but I should have consulted with somebody else. But everybody around me came to my defense, and I think the main reason is that they just didn't want to open up a can of worms in the relationships between us and him. Not sure one way or the other about whether anybody but me and him had opinions about that sound. But my opinion, as I said, was I kind of agreed with him. He was right. I should have worked harder on that sound. But anyway, the cartridge was a small project, and it is what it is. And I don't remember it very well anyway. But then I got into the cassette tape mastering part of it. And you were asking earlier about what that process was. And to the best of my recollection is we came up with exactly one tape converter machine, which is essentially, I believe, a copy of his box. Opened up, hook up a bunch of wires to it to pull off the digital signal, feed it into an Atari. I forget how we did that. I mean, for all I know, we went through the 850. I don't remember. But it got digitized so that it could then be inside an 800, and then the 800 turned around and wrote it back out to the, I think probably we used our standard little cassette machine. And of course the sound channel was probably just being sent out in parallel with that. Now the background of that was, well, a few things. For one thing, the tape mastering was a manual process. You stuck one of his tapes into the input machine, you stuck a blank tape into the output machine and pushed go on both machines or something. So there was a tech who had to come back and check on this once every 45 minutes or however long a tape was. But his mastering process, and I'm not sure that I remember for sure what his encoding was, but I think on his cassettes it was pretty much similar to ours, except different. Similar being that it was like a two-tone system, just like ours was, with the encoding was audio. So it was digitized by reading it off as highs and lows after going through a filter and turned into a serial interface with probably a lot of jitter, and hopefully was read effectively into your machine. Redigitizing it, of course, allowed us to resynchronize the signal, which was a good thing. But the other thing is that their mastering process, and I believe they just copied this straight off onto their mass-produced tapes, was a physical process where the operator of the machine would be using his voice to say things and typing things so that the text would show up, and then some special keys to handle the stopping of the tape so that a question could be answered. But they're in their original mastering process, they would rewind and overwrite pieces of tape and stuff like that. And the effect was that, particularly at the start of a section, lots of little glitchy characters showed up. And it was sort of just inherent in the system, and none of us knew what to do about it. And we certainly, I hate to say it, but we weren't going to assign someone to sit there and re-edit all this stuff. So it was basically just a straight copy. It was redigitized to the extent that the bit timing was straightened out, at least. But after that, the mastering was done with tapes running at normal speed. So that produced a master cassette. And by the way, the master was a cassette. It wasn't a reel-to-reel tape or anything with higher quality than what a cassette could be. I think the master was used to create submasters, so that master, of course, wouldn't be worn out through the manufacturing process. And the submasters were then sent off to tape reproduction companies, which then did high-speed reproduction. Of course, high-speed reproduction produces all sorts of jitter. So it was an interesting process. But for the most part, it worked. I think the main problem was those glitchy characters at the beginning of a segment, and that's really more from Dorset's originals because of the way they wound the tapes back and forth while they were doing the original production of the material. The two companies didn't stay together forever, and so I suspect that's why your earlier comments about how other people have come along after the fact and have taken and worked on things to master more of his tapes. That's marvelous to hear, frankly. It's really nice to even to get that information. I appreciate the after the fact history here.
But yeah, that's recent history too. That was just last year, so it was a fun project to watch happen. Well, neat. Yeah, so basically, I mean, I understand that the Dorsets had this machine that would play the tapes. So I assume the machine was using the tapes in this particular format, and you were converting from their education machine format to the Atari format.
Mm-hmm. And really, the only change was the tones that were used to represent zeros and ones. But obviously, they weren't compatible.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Even then, you talk about the fact that the audio is being copied. There would have been a little bit of audio degradation as well. So it wasn't ideal. I wouldn't be surprised when you say recent stuff. Is he still in business, or is there a follow-on company over there?
Oh, it's not a company. It's a hobbyist who did it just to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, because nobody wants to learn this way anymore.
Since the two companies went their separate ways, I wouldn't be surprised if he eventually came up with a newer model that changed the format too. But again,
I don't think they did. I think they stuck with it to the bitter end.
Well, it's nice to hear of a hobbyist out there. That's really cool.
Yeah. Neat. Did you do any other software? For instance, some of the early Atari Program Exchange software is uncredited. It's just credited to Atari, but of course it was made by employees. I'm wondering if you did any of that or any other software.
Not me.
Okay.
In fact, that was pretty much the last software that I actually did. My last year at Atari, I was promoted and became a manager. In fact, that's the reason I left. It was truly a mismatch. I suppose it was a learning experience in terms of knowing what I was probably not ever going to want to do again in my life. And Atari itself was falling apart during that last year I was there. So my total, historically, I think to myself that I worked there for 7 years. I think the truth is probably more like 6.5. I rounded it up for some reason. But it was that last year that, everything was falling apart around me, but I'm the sort of person who's impervious to that normally. The story about the rats leaving the sinking ship. If you look at the rest of my career, I'm one of the rats who went down repeatedly with the sinking ships. But no, I left Atari purely out of unhappiness, and it was because I was in the wrong role. Now, my manager was very happy with what I was doing, but my internal state just didn't fit.
So what were you managing while you were managing?
I don't remember. The one thing that I do know that came out after during my tenure, but I don't remember how much I had to do with it, was that next generation printer that was in the new, more white with the brushed aluminum. The very first printer that came out in that form factor was a little small printer that had, I think it had a rotating drum and a rubber print. I don't even remember how it printed. I know the ink pad was a little rotating rubberized, sort of like an ink pad would be, except it rolled around a roller. As I don't remember what even the name of that printer was, but by then I was more just a consultant to those sorts of things. I wasn't developing things anymore. And if I didn't answer your previous question with regard to the Atari Exchange, the answer is no. I didn't have anything to do with that.
Okay.
Sorry to put that answer out of order.
That's fine. Cool. So ultimately you quit and went on to other things?
Yep.
So give me the brief summary of the 35 years since and what you do to keep yourself busy today.
Okay. Let's see. That company I went to was in Milpitas. It was named Braegen, Braegen. They did a knockoff or a clone of the main computer terminal that went with all the IBM 360s and 370s in those days. It was reasonably successful product, which was hard to sell because IBM's sales model made it such that people didn't really look at anything but pure IBM. The real problem, of course, is that was the end of the life of that terminal, and IBM was going in different directions by then. So I lasted there for a year, and they were having financial problems, and that's how I exited that company. It was one of their many. I forget. I don't think they were public, so there were issues with regard to financing and stuff. I believe the next company I went to, and I was there for a long, long time, was Ungerman Bass. So I got involved with local area networking, enterprise equipment. At the time I joined them, they were doing things in daughter cards for local connections for IBM PCs, basically. And IBM undercut that by coming out with another machine where everything was built into the motherboard, and daughter cards, became dinosaurs. See, that actually was before my time. That was one of their two bread and butter things. They were also doing phone closet Ethernet hubs. But the first project that I hired in at was a different kind of daughter card. Again, I believe it was for PCs. I'm not sure whether they put it on any other bus. But it was for a different serial protocol or networking protocol that was just coming into the world at that time, called MAP, the Manufacturing Automation Protocol. And my first project was to do the half of the firmware for that card, which downloaded the rest of the, I believe the driver was soft rather than hard in those cards. And so I did the download protocol for that card. And then transitioned to their network management product. I believe it was called LAN Manager. And all of the rest of my time there was as a internal, in other words, not user interface, software, what's the word for that, system developer, as opposed to the front end or user interface developer for their network management group. And my specialty in that group was to become the programmer who worked on the SQL Server parts of the product. That particular SQL Server was the Sybase product, which you may know that the SQL Server that Microsoft did was a spin-off because they did a joint development for a while with Sybase. So, but I was there for a long time. Ungerman Bass wasn't the best player in the market, And so they were purchased by Tandem Computers for a while, and I think Tandem spun them off and gave them to Newbridge Networks, who basically folded it. So there's another sinking ship experience that I had. I believe that was 96, 98, somewhere in that time frame. So about half a year later, I got a job at a consulting company called INS, Industrial Networking. They were mostly consulting with companies putting in enterprise networks. So in a sense, I was working for the same kind of group. And what had happened was that Skunkworks within that company had put together a network management product, and was based on the SQL Server again, except this time it was the Microsoft version of it. They were selling that product not just as a product, but also as a service. They, since they were a consulting group, they would go in and install the computer in the company's machine room, and the engineers would fly around and actually go in and service the machines and keep the software up to date and all that kind of stuff. For the most part, my time at that company, and by the way, it was only that company for less than a year. They got absorbed into Lucent Technologies. And of course, Lucent was into phone stuff, and to have a network management enterprise thing was like this little tiny afterthought that was only in there because they had purchased INS. But we had a little group of people who built these machines, and essentially were the service operation for the field engineers to build these machines. And I became an in-house consultant for that period of time. The really hard problems when something was just acting really weird with that product, and a field engineer was out there freezing to death in a machine room, I would be one of the two people who took the phone calls and had to really understand the product in depth enough to have, oh yeah, I heard of that problem, you're only the second person to see it, kind of thing. So in-house consulting was kind of where I ended. I was laid off again because, Lucent Technologies and Alcatel had merged at that point, so we were sort of a half-French company, but things were in a downhill spiral because of the too much buildup of phone equipment at the beginning of the 2000s. And everybody was in trouble. It wasn't just us, Nortel, all the other companies. So I got laid off out of that. And partly out of burnout, just didn't look for another job. So I'm in retirement at this point.
Nice. So what do you do to keep yourself busy today?
Well, I play my flutes. The Native American flute has been, I don't think avocation is quite the right word. Passion, I guess, is a better word. Since 2003. The other main thing, and I want to mention this because it actually has an Atari tie-in, my boss for most of the years, as I mentioned his name earlier, was Brian Johnston. He had a little tiny interaction with me, just one of these one moments in time that, affects you for the rest of your life. He invited me to a workshop or a lecture about a workshop. And that's had ramifications that have reverberated throughout the rest of my life. In fact, I've been wanting to get in touch with him to tell him that he had this, he was a person who had this very important moment in time interaction with me. But the result of that is my spiritual side, which is that over time I've become a Buddhist. And there's a long chain of things that went into that. But, my religion, my spiritual life throughout my life has been important to me. But to have my life go that way, I had that interaction with Brian many years ago. And I've been wanting to get in touch with him and tell him that story.
So what haven't I asked you about your time at Atari that I should have?
I'm feeling pretty complete, actually.
All right.
Certainly in terms of thinking through my story for the last couple of days before this interview, everything's been covered.
If you could send a message to the Atari computer users that still exist, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Oh, my goodness. Well, that's out of the blue. I didn't think of that question ahead of time. Well, actually, what I would say is I'm amazed. I never really felt that it was that great a machine. That it had a following and still has a following. I'm just thrilled.
Great. Think I have what I need. Thank you.
Likewise, it's really great you were able to find me.
Yeah, I'm glad I did. Excellent. Thank you so much, Scott.
I'm thrilled. This is wonderful.
Me too. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.